14 men were standing in the rain on the banks of the Kootenai River in northern Idaho on a Thursday morning in October of 2019, when the call came through on the project radio that the rented crane had failed its load test for the third time that week. The bridge section, 112 feet of fabricated steel decking weighing just under 41 tons, was sitting on temporary cribbing 30 feet from the water's edge, and the deadline for the span installation was 48 hours out. The general contractor had a crane on site that had cost $750,000 to mobilize from Portland. It had a certified operator, a full rigging crew, a load chart laminated and zip-tied to the boom, and it could not do the job. The soil conditions at the river's edge were soft enough that the crane's outrigger pads were sinking under the combined load of the machine and the bridge section, and every time the operator tried to swing the load over the water, the numbers on the load chart said stop, so they stopped. 3 times. The project superintendent, a man named Darrell Voss, who had been building bridges in the inland Northwest for 22 years, was standing next to the cribbing in a rain jacket that had long since stopped being waterproof, looking at a bridge section that needed to move 40 feet laterally and set down on 2 concrete abutments with a tolerance of 3/4 of an inch, and he was out of ideas. One of his crew said something about calling the crane company back in Portland for a different machine. Another man said they'd need to wait 2 weeks minimum. Voss didn't say anything. He put his hand on the steel deck in the way a man puts his hand on something he is responsible for and cannot move, and he stood there for a moment. Then someone on the crew said a name. Said it quietly, the way you say a name when you're not sure if suggesting it is an insult or a lifeline. The name was Meredith Callaway. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because if I just tell you that Meredith Callaway showed up with a 1956 Northwest 80D crawler crane and set that bridge section clean on a Thursday afternoon, while 14 men and a $750,000 modern rig watched from the bank, you will think I'm telling you a story about luck, or about stubbornness, or about some picturesque old machine that happened to be in the right place. I am not telling you any of those things. I am telling you a story about knowledge so deep it looks like magic to the people who don't have it, and about a woman who spent 40 years acquiring it in a place and a way that nobody gave her credit for. The luck had nothing to do with it. Let me tell you who Meredith Callaway is, and then let me tell you what that machine is, and then let me tell you what happened on that river bank, because all 3 of those things matter equally, and you cannot understand the third without the first 2. Meredith Callaway grew up on her family's logging operation outside of Bonners Ferry, Idaho, which is a town of roughly 2,000 people in the far northern panhandle of the state, close enough to the Canadian border that her father used to say you could smell the difference in the air when the wind came down from the north. Her grandfather, a man named Chet Callaway, had built the operation from a single skidder and a timber lease in 1951, and by the time Meredith was born in 1967, it had grown to include a small sawmill, a log yard, a shop with a hydraulic press and a line-boring machine, and a collection of equipment that Chet maintained with the philosophy that a machine properly cared for outlasts the man who bought it, and should outlast the man who inherited it, too. Chet died in 1978, when Meredith was 11. Her father, Gary Callaway, kept the operation running and kept the philosophy intact. And Meredith grew up in the shop the way some children grow up in libraries, not because anyone assigned her there, but because it was where the interesting things were. She was not, in the beginning, considered the heir to the operation. She had 2 older brothers, both of whom worked the timber side, ran equipment, understood the business. Meredith worked the shop. She learned to weld at 13 from a man named Earl Hutchins, who had done structural work on pipelines in Alaska and come back to Bonner's Ferry with bad knees and extraordinary hands. She learned hydraulics from the service manuals her father kept in a wooden box under the workbench, manuals for machines that were already old when the manuals were printed, and she learned to read them the way you learn to read a language. Slowly at first, then fluently, then in a way where the language stops feeling like translation and starts feeling like thought. By the time she was 19, she was doing the line boring work herself, setting up the bar, indicating it true, cutting main bearing bores and excavator frames that the dealer shops in Spokane said couldn't be done in the field. She was doing it in a shop in northern Idaho with a machine her grandfather had bought used in 1963. Her brothers left the operation in the early 90s. One moved to Coeur d'Alene, one to Missoula. The timber market had changed. The lease situation had changed and the sawmill closed in 1994. Gary Callaway held on to the equipment and the land, and Meredith stayed. She was 27 years old, living in the house she grew up in, running a one-woman equipment repair and rigging operation out of the family shop, and she was doing it with machines that had been considered old when her grandfather was running them. She had a D8 Caterpillar from 1959 that she had rebuilt the final drives on twice. She had a Peterbilt 359 with a lowboy that she used for transport. She had a Northwest 80D crawler crane that had come to the Callaway operation in 1961, when Chet bought it from a highway department surplus auction in Coeur d'Alene for $4,200, and which had not left the family since. I need you to understand what the Northwest 80D is, because without this, the rest of the story is just a number and a date. The Northwest Engineering Company built cranes in Green Bay, Wisconsin, from the 1920s through the 1980s, and for a substantial portion of that time, they built machines that the logging and construction industries in the American Northwest used for the kind of work that required patience and precision more than speed. The 80D was a crawler crane, meaning it moved on steel tracks like a bulldozer, with a lattice boom that could be configured in multiple lengths and a drum arrangement that gave the operator extremely fine control over hook speed. Not fast control. Fine control. There is a difference that matters enormously in certain kinds of work, and I will get to it. The 80D, in its standard configuration with a 60-foot boom, had a rated lift capacity of approximately 42 tons at a short radius. Now, 42 tons sounds like a coincidence when I tell you the bridge section weighed 41 tons. But it is not a coincidence, and it is not the most important number in this story. The most important number is this. The 80D weighed, with its counterweight installed and its tracks fully tensioned, approximately 84,000 pounds, 42 tons. The machine weighed as much as it could lift, which is a ratio that tells you something about how it was designed. It was designed to be stable. It was designed to put its weight on the ground through a wide track footprint and stay there while the load moved, rather than to reach far and lift light. It was a machine built for the specific physics of heavy, close work. The kind of work where you're not swinging a load across a parking lot but setting it down in a place with very little room for error. Here is what nobody standing on that riverbank in the rain had thought about yet. The modern crane, the $750,000 machine from Portland, was failing because its outrigger pads were sinking into soft ground under the combined weight of the crane and the suspended load. Outriggers work by spreading the crane's weight across a larger footprint, but they are point loads. 4 pads, each carrying a concentrated portion of the total weight, pressing down into ground that is soft near a riverbank in October after 2 weeks of rain. The math was not working. The soil was not cooperating. The load chart said stop, and the ground agreed. The Northwest 80D does not have outriggers. It has tracks, and tracks distribute weight differently than outrigger pads. Not at 4 points, but across the entire length of both track frames, which on the 80D measured approximately 14 feet long and 8 feet wide. The ground pressure of the 80D at full weight, with the load suspended, was lower per square inch than the ground pressure of the modern crane on its outrigger pads. Not because the 80D weighed less. It didn't, but because the weight was spread across a fundamentally different contact area with the ground. A crawler crane on soft ground is not the same problem as a truck crane on soft ground. They are different machines making different demands on the earth beneath them, and Meredith Callaway had known this since she was in her 20s, because she had worked soft ground with the 80D in the log yard after spring thaw, in conditions that would have stopped a wheeled or outrigger machine cold. There was one other thing. The 80D had to travel to the riverbank. It had to travel on its own tracks, across the same soft ground that was causing the outrigger crane problems, and it had to do it while carrying its own boom and rigging. Meredith had done this before. She knew what the track sounded like when the ground was given. She knew the difference in the way the machine sat when it was on solid purchase versus when it was floating slightly on saturated soil, and she knew how to read the ground ahead of the tracks the way a river pilot reads the water ahead of the bow. She had been reading that particular kind of ground for 30 years. When Darrell Voss called her that Thursday morning, she was in the shop doing an injector sleeve replacement on a D6 that belonged to a logging contractor out of Troy. She listened to what he said. She asked 3 questions. What was the soil like at the bank? How far was the lift radius from the center line of the crane to the center line of the abutment? And what was the tolerance on placement? Voss told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would be there in 2 hours. She loaded the 80D on the lowboy herself, which took 45 minutes because the ramps had to be positioned correctly for the track width and the machine had to be centered precisely for transport. She drove the Peterbilt north on Highway 95 in the rain, the old crane riding on the trailer behind her, its boom broken down into transport configuration, the counterweight riding on a separate trailer she pulled with a service truck driven by her one employee, a 24-year-old named Kyle Brandt, who'd been working for her for 18 months and who, by his own later account, did not fully understand what he was about to watch. She arrived at the job site at 11:40 in the morning. The modern crane was sitting on its outrigger pads near the bank, its operator in the cab, its rigging crew standing nearby in rain gear, 14 men on the site. She backed the lowboy to a position she had selected from the road before she pulled in, and she and Kyle began unloading the 80D. One of the riggers from the modern crane crew walked over and watched for a moment. He was a young man, maybe 25, and he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the old crawler come off the ramps, and his expression was the expression of someone watching a demonstration of something he has already decided is irrelevant. Meredith did not notice him, or if she noticed him, she did not register him. She was watching the tracks meet the ground. It took her an hour and 10 minutes to set up the machine. Track tension checked, boom assembled to the configuration she had calculated on the drive up, rigging laid out, load block hung, counterweight verified. She walked the ground between the machine's planned position and the bank 3 times, pressing her heel into the soil at intervals, watching the water that came up around her boot. She adjusted her planned position twice based on what she found. Then she climbed into the cab. The 80D's engine, a 4-cylinder diesel that had been rebuilt in the Callaway shop in 2003 and again in 2014, started the way old diesels start in cold, wet weather, which is to say it started with deliberate authority, a sound that is not the sound of modern equipment, not electronic and immediate but mechanical and earned, a low compression knock that smoothed as the cylinders warmed and the oil pressure came up and the machine settled into its idle with the sound of something that had been doing this for 60 years and intended to continue. The exhaust came up from the vertical stack in a thin thread of gray that thickened briefly and then cleared as the engine found its temperature. Several of the men on the bank turned to look. She walked the machine to the bank on its tracks, traveling slowly, watching the ground ahead, watching the way the tracks pressed into the soil and whether the impression they left was uniform or whether one side was sinking more than the other. The machine moved at walking pace, maybe 2 miles per hour, and it moved with the particular deliberateness of a machine that is heavy and knows it. When she reached her planned lift position, she stopped, set the swing brake, and climbed down. She walked around the machine once, looking at the track impressions, pressing her boot into the ground beside each track. Then she climbed back up. Darrell Voss was standing 20 feet away. He had been watching her since she arrived, and he had not said anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been in the way. He had been building bridges for 22 years, and he understood, at a level below words, that he was watching someone work. The rigging of the bridge section took 30 minutes. She used a 4-point lift with spreader beams to distribute the load across the section's length, and she set the sling angles herself, calculating them on a notepad she kept in her jacket pocket and checking the result against the load chart she had laminated and kept in the cab. A load chart that was older than most of the men on the site and had been annotated in pencil in her father's handwriting and then in her own. When the rigging was set, she climbed back into the cab. Now, I want you to understand what happened next, because it did not look the way you might expect it to look. The 80D took the load off the cribbin the way a draft horse takes a load off the ground. Not with drama, not with a lurch or a surge of noise, but with a steady application of force that built from nothing to everything without a visible moment of transition. The drums turned. The wire rope came taut. The cribbin began to unload as the bridge section found the hook, and then the section lifted. A fraction of an inch, 6 inches, and it was in the air. The engine note did not change. The machine did not move. The tracks sat on the ground exactly as they had sat before. The load came on because the machine had been designed for this, because the weight was going into the ground through the tracks, and the tracks were distributing it across 14 feet of soil contact on each side, and the soil was holding. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything. The rigger, who had been watching with his hands in his pockets, had taken his hands out of his pockets. She swung the load, slowly. The 80D's swing is not fast. It is geared for control, not speed. And the bridge section moved through the air the way the minute hand of a clock moves, which is to say, it moved in a way that you could perceive but could not quite catch in the act of moving. It traveled across the bank and out over the water, 41 tons of steel suspended from a 60-year-old machine on a crawler that was pressing into soft ground at the edge of the Kootenai River, and it went where she put it. The load swayed once, a small pendulum motion as the swing stopped, and she corrected it with a brief counterswing so small it was almost invisible from the bank, a touch of the control that settled the load into stillness 30 feet above the abutments. Then she lowered it. The bridge section came down onto the abutments at a pace that I can only describe as intentional. Not slow in the way that slow means uncertain. Slow in the way that slow means controlled, the way a surgeon is slow, the way a man threading a needle is slow, the way any person is slow when they are doing something that requires the full application of everything they know. The load chart in the cab said she had a tolerance of 3/4 of an inch on placement. She set the section within a 1/4 inch on the first attempt. Voss measured it himself with a tape measure, and then he measured it again, and then he stood up from the abutment bearing and looked at the cab of the 80D for a moment before he wrote the number in his field book. She lowered the rigging, unhooked, and walked the machine back from the bank. The total time from first lift to rigging released was 41 minutes. The modern crane had been on site for 3 days. Kyle Brandt was standing by the service truck when she climbed down from the cab, and he said something to her. Later, he couldn't remember exactly what. Something about how she had known the machine would hold on that ground. And she said what she always said when someone asked her how she knew something about that machine. She said she'd been running it since she was 22 and it had never lied to her yet. The rigging foreman from the modern crane crew, a man in his late 40s named Phil Garrett, who had been in the rigging industry since he was an apprentice, walked over to where she was standing. He looked at the bridge section sitting on the abutments. He looked at the 80D. He asked her what year it was. She told him 1956. He nodded once, the way a man nods when something he has suspected has been confirmed. Then he asked her about the ground pressure calculation, and she showed him the notepad. He studied it for a moment and handed it back. He said he hadn't thought about it that way. She said most people didn't. Darrell Voss shook her hand before she loaded the machine back on the lowboy. He thanked her. She said the weather was supposed to clear by Friday, which would help with the deck work. He said yes, probably. There was a pause. He said he'd been building bridges for 22 years, and he'd never seen a placement that clean. She said the machine was built for it. Then she and Kyle loaded the 80D, secured the boom and the counterweight trailer, and drove back south on Highway 95 in the rain. The D6 with the injector sleeve job was waiting in the shop. The bridge over the Kootenai River opened to traffic in December of 2019 on schedule. The bridge section that Meredith Callaway set with the 1956 Northwest 80D is the center span. If you drive Highway 2 across that bridge today, you drive across work that a $750,000 modern crane could not do, and a 63-year-old crawler did in 41 minutes. The 80D is still in the shop in Bonner's Ferry. Meredith Callaway still runs it when the work calls for it, which is more often than you might expect, because the work that calls for a crawler crane on soft ground with fine hook control and a patient operator does not disappear just because the industry has moved on to faster machines. The machine has had 2 engine rebuilds, 1 boom section replaced after a crack was found in a weld in 1997, and the drums have been re-spooled 3 times. The cab still has the original seat, which Meredith has covered with a piece of closed-cell foam and a canvas cover she made herself. The load chart with her father's pencil annotations is still laminated and mounted where she can see it from the seat. She is 57 years old. She still does the line boring work. She still drives the Peterbilt. She still lives in the house she grew up in, on the land her grandfather bought in the early 1950s, and she still pays her bills early and her taxes on time and does not carry debt if she can avoid it. Kyle Brandt is still working for her. He is learning to run the ADD. She says he has good hands, which from her is the full measure of a person. The $750,000 crane went back to Portland. If you have ever watched someone do a thing that looked impossible and understood, in the watching, that it was not impossible at all, that it only looked that way because you had been watching the wrong things, then you understand what the 14 men on the bank of the Kootenai River understood that Thursday afternoon. The machine was not magic. The knowledge was not mysterious. It was the product of 40 years of quiet work in a shop in northern Idaho, of reading manuals by lamplight, of pressing a boot heel into soft ground and knowing what the ground was telling you, of understanding a machine so completely that you and the machine were no longer two separate things making a decision but one system operating from a single body of knowledge. The ground doesn't lie. Soft soil doesn't care what a crane cost or where it came from or how many logos are on the side of the cab. It tells you what it can hold, and it tells you in the same language it has always used, which is the language of pressure and displacement, and the physics of weight distributed across area. Meredith Callaway spoke that language. The ADD spoke that language. The Portland crane spoke a different language, and the Kootenai riverbank was not interested in translation. That is the whole story. Except that it isn't, quite, because there is one more thing I want to tell you. 3 weeks after the bridge section was set, Phil Garrett, the rigging foreman, the man who had asked about the ground pressure calculation, drove up to Bonner's Ferry from Spokane on a Saturday morning without calling ahead. He pulled into the Callaway property at 9 in the morning and found Meredith in the shop doing a cylinder head on the D8. He stood in the door for a moment, and she looked up, and he said he had some questions about the ADD if she had time. She told him to get a stool from the corner, and she'd finish the head, and then they could talk. He stayed until 3 in the afternoon. He left with a copy of the Northwest ADD service manual that she had photocopied for him on the shop copier, annotated in the margins in her handwriting, and with a better understanding of crawler crane ground pressure than he had acquired in 20-plus years of rigging work. He sent her a card 2 weeks later. It said, "Thank you," and then it said something else, which was this: that he had been in the industry long enough to know that the most important thing a person can learn is what they don't know, and that she had taught him something he hadn't known he was missing. She kept the card. It's in the wooden box under the workbench next to the service manuals. If you know a story like this one, a person, a machine, a piece of knowledge that the industry had forgotten or never bothered to learn, put it in the comments below. I mean that. I read every one of them, and the best ones become the next story on this channel. There are more of these stories than most people realize, and they are sitting in shops and barns and equipment yards all across this country, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and take the time to write them down. That is what this channel exists to do. If you are new here, consider subscribing, because every week there is another story about someone who did the quiet work, and the quiet work turned out to be the only work that mattered. And if this story is the kind of story you think someone else needs to hear, a rigger, you know, a crane operator, someone who has been told that the old way is the wrong way, pass it on. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. That is how they have always survived. That is how they survive now. The ADD is in the shop in Bonner's Ferry. The engine is warm,